Hey everyone, welcome back to Comics Rot Your Brain, the podcast where professional screenwriters talk about the comic books that we love, mostly from the 1980s. This week's spotlight is on Screamer. It's published by DC Comics in 1988. It was a proto-Vertigo book as it was edited by Karen Berger. It was written by Peter Milligan with art by Brett Ewins and Steve Dillion. This is a fierce and unrelenting dystopian vision. It's part gangster saga, part apocalyptic fable. And Peter Milligan, he weaves this sharp literary narrative that feels like it echoes the rise and fall grandeur of The Godfather. While Brett Ewins and Steve Dillion, their artwork, it drenches this story with a grimy, kinetic energy that you have to see. This is no simple crime story. It's a meditation on power and fate and the cycles of violence, and it's told with the fatalism of like a film noir and the ferocity of a cyberpunk anthem. If you're a fan of our show, then like, comment, and subscribe. It costs you nothing to subscribe, and it means everything to us. Also, join our Patreon, which is at www.patreon.com/Comics Rot Your Brain. There will be a link in the show notes. We're rolling out something massive this year that will be exclusive to members. And now, on with the show. But then we go back to Finnegan's story, and it's like that moment, like he's on the run, he's trying to save his family, and he finds this whiskey. Because it's interesting how like whiskey and alcohol is this major kind of like this scarcity for it. And you realize that, wow, in a world like this, like how many people would be just trying to self-medicate just to survive, and it's kept on this really small quantity level that when he can steal a bottle of whiskey, he realizes that he can sell that to like for drugs, to for pharmaceuticals, like it's got that much kind of like street currency. I think that's like a fascinating like this commentary on how he's orchestrating this world. Because you would think that that's the thing too. There's not much like explicit kind of like drug use, like the narcotics. But I wonder if that's just a thing about what you'd be able to put in a story like a comic like this.
I mean, I don't know, man. They put a lot in here. Like, I can't imagine what they're holding back.
Well, you're right, but I'm just wondering. It's like, well, but there's no one shooting up. There's no one snorting cocaine. It's just,
It's funny if that's where they draw the line when you consider some of the stuff we're about to get to. Like, this is so fucking wild. Yeah, and just I think you're right. The Vicky character is fascinating, and there's some really just compelling stuff going on with all the characters here. And really, you could explore the motivations of every single character. All the men and women in this storyline seem to have multiple agendas, and they all have a lot of stuff going on. And I think none of the characters are exactly what they seem at first blush. And there's a lot of a rich kind of there's a rich inner life to every one of these characters. And I think it's what's really compelling the further you go down this rabbit hole. I think that as we go through issue 2, Vito goes and rescues his buddy Dutch, who's got his face chewed off by the rat. Dutch doesn't realize yet that Vito was also kind of aware that this was going to be happening, or Vito was aware that he was putting Dutch in a very dangerous, precarious place, or that he knew this was going to happen to him. Dutch is still thinking that Vito's his friend at this point. And then we cut to Vicky sort of having a little bit of regret over what she did, and we realize she's on her own path. And then we cut back to the childhood, as you said, when they were just a kid gang, and we realized that Dutch as a kid had this horrible fear of rats, which Vicky was capitalizing on. And then we come out of there and we see that we go to the Finnegan family back in the quasi-present day or closer to present day, and the Finnegan family is having issues with one of their daughters being really sick. And so Finnegan himself goes out for a walk, and this is where he finds the whiskey that he essentially steals off of this homeless guy or this drunk who's drinking whiskey, which is valuable in this world. He steals the whiskey off him, gets in a fight with him, and takes it away from this dude, and it's really like the first bad thing that Finnegan has done. I think it's the first time he's sort of done something morally questionable. And then when Finnegan, at that point, is on his way home, he encounters Jesus on a cross and has this religious moment staring. We've got a lot of religious symbolism throughout the story. This is now our second cross imagery that's like full page imagery of Jesus on the cross. In the first issue, we had Dutch on the cross, and now we have actual Jesus on the cross. There's a ton of biblical allusions going on throughout Screamer, and it's something we hear a lot of in the narration. And not only biblical allusions, but there's this idea that is returned to over and over again that ultimately pays off about whether or not God has foreknowledge of what is going to happen to human beings, or whether God, in allowing human beings to have free will, that God themselves has no foreknowledge of what is to happen to human beings. And that's something that is just a question we return to over and over again. But here, Finnegan, after he steals the whiskey from the wino, when he was taking a break from his house and his sick daughter and all the stress of it all, now he finds himself on his knees in front of Jesus. He's praying, as the description says here. He'd almost forgotten how to pray and to whom he might pray, to this cracked Christ, this broken altar. But the light still squeezed in, all the ruin, the filth, all the destruction. It hadn't completely blocked out the light. And then Finnegan makes this really earnest prayer about his daughter. And he says, please, God, if you just let Katie live, I know I shouldn't have taken the whiskey, but I know you'll understand. Just let my Katie get better. And then we hear from there, Finnegan goes home, but he suddenly hears wailing as he gets closer to his apartment. And we realize that the worst has happened. His daughter, Katie, has died. And so there is this connection, I think, that's being suggested by Milligan here, that Finnegan has now fallen from grace. He's done his first sin, in a way. He's committed his first sin. And immediately in the aftermath of it, his sick daughter dies. And the only reason he was committing this sin was to try to help figure out a way to get money, to help get medicine for his sick daughter. But even still, he's immediately punished by the fates, by God, by what have you. His daughter dies. He drops the whiskey bottle, the metaphor, the symbol of his sin. He drops it immediately. It shatters, and he sits down in the rain. And Finnegan sits down, and the description, I just want to read this very last bit here. The description says, he sat down and he looked up. My grandfather, he looked up at the sky, the empty, empty sky. They buried Kate Finnegan 2 days later in the blasted ruins of a forgotten church. And I just want to point out how beautiful Pete Milligan's prose is, because Milligan is writing in a way that is so evocative, and it's so lovely, and it's a way of writing that's almost disappeared really in modern comics. And I think back in the day when Alan Moore would do this also to great effect, some people would criticize Alan Moore, and I think Alan Moore himself has joked about his tendencies toward so-called purple prose in Swamp Thing and how his descriptions would go on and on and on sometimes. But for me, I always loved that about Alan Moore. And here with Pete Milligan, I think he's striking the perfect balance, because he's not overdoing it. He's not overwriting. But if you read, just some of the word choices are so incredibly emotional and evocative. And he's really going for it. Like at every time where there's a major shattering moment, a major emotional moment, Pete Milligan is not holding back. He's just going for it. And he's really just twisting the knife at every opportunity, emotionally and intellectually. The story's working on so many levels, but I think that the narration and the way that he allows the narrator to speak in such singular language, I think is a big part of how this story kind of sticks to your ribs, because it's like poetry at times. It's like brutal, harsh, awful poetry. You know what I mean? Just the same way when you read Clockwork Orange and you read the way Anthony Burgess kind of writes out certain sentences and certain things, it's the poetry that I think really helps it work. And I think it's a lot easier to kind of hide behind like, oh, just let the artist handle it. Let the artist do everything. Let the artist convey the sadness. Let the artist do. And I think, sure, the artist is going to do their share, but I think Pete Milligan is not shirking his duty as the writer here. He is showing up with some incredible turns of phrase that for me, a lot of them were just devastating. Like there's moments in here where just the language itself is just so brutal, and it's a big part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you make a good point. Is that, in terms of the balance of how much it's not that he's giving description. I mean, look, he's describing emotional states of the characters, and that, um I think, look, this is in this age when the thought balloon was disappearing, or had probably fully disappeared, and I
Yep.
think that, it's sometimes I think that was a good thing to have in comics, is because you get it in novels all the time, but I feel that it might have been somewhat. I guess it got to the point where it's somewhat obtrusive in comics because of like where you're going to put the thought balloon, but usually these kind of like, like these boxes of description, they usually go, I mean, some people obviously like I remember like in not Dark Knight, but in Sin City, like Frank Miller will have like a whole panel that's just description about stuff, but you're right. It's like the word choice and how he's trying to like to channel you into the story more, and make you feel like what this guy is going through. Just the rest of them. I mean, it's not just Finnegan, but everyone what they're going through. Because there's a certain amount of the acting that you can't get in the drawings. It's one of these things that I talk about on my other podcast about how how filmmakers use music to say what the images can't say, and there's times where you just can't, like you can't get anyone's like so they'll use music to be like what's the to help push the internal state of a character. And I think that's what he does so well in this book, so we understand again what people are like suffering through, because there's a lot of suffering in this, and I don't think there's
Totally.
anyone who like
Yeah.
who escapes a high degree of suffering that that might break most people. It's interesting you say that he makes this comment about this is the first sin that he makes, and again it goes back to that choice he made in the first issue not to let those girls get sold into slavery, and every choice he
Yes.
has to make to see, it's like, what, he chose to save other people, not his family, and now his family suffers from every choice that he now makes, and it's letting you know, it's like, well, are you better off being selfish and saving your own family, or are you trying to be like to protect the greater good? Like what can we? Because you think about a society
Yeah.
like this, a society like this, like only collapses when everyone gets to be too selfish. And that's what I think is what he's kind of like exploring a lot. Again, it's a great thing to do to show the average Joe what he or she is having to go through, like in this world that's just so tragically brutal.
Oh
Yeah, I
God.
mean,
Yeah, suffering. Suffering is the right word. Like everyone suffers. Everyone suffers so horribly. Like, and I could see someone calling this story nihilistic and, just so hopeless and violent and brutal. But there really is also just this this aspect of religion and yearning for something better that is represented by Finnegan and the characters who are really trying desperately to have some goodness and some moral grounding in their life. But ultimately, Milligan's asking hard questions here. He's forcing everyone reading this to try to put themselves in the shoes of these characters and just ask yourself, yeah, what would you do if you had a sick daughter who needed medicine, and now you're being faced with this choice of, do you piss off these brutal gang lords so that your sick daughter can get medicine? I mean, or no, do you do what the brutal gang lords want you to do, so that, but then by doing so destroy the lives of these other innocent girls, and in so doing save your daughter? Or do you do the right thing, quote unquote, and like, yeah, sure, you free these people and you don't sell them into a life of slavery? Of course that's the right thing, but then by doing that you're dooming your own daughter to death.
yeah,
You're dooming your own daughter to a life where now she's not going to get medicine and you're going to be in danger and these gang lords are coming after you. It's a fucking horrible Sophie's choice predicament
constantly,
that Milligan,
constantly.
yeah,
Sophie's choice.
constantly. And this poor character Finnegan, it's going to get worse for him.
It's gonna get
Like it's
way
just,
worse for him.
it's
It's
just,
gonna get so worse that it's hard. I mean, we'll get to it.
yeah. I mean, I just want to say, I think this is although not perfect, but what story is. And yes, there's a lot of issues, as we've discussed, that you could certainly talk about that are things that could be done differently or better in some ways with Screamer. Just overall, this is a very serious piece of work that has a tremendous amount of stuff about it that is really quite impressive, along with being transgressive and boundary breaking. Like we talked about, the art is at an incredibly high level. The storytelling from Ewins and Dillion, along with the design work, the acting of the art, and just so much of this is just done at such an incredibly high level, and it's so ambitious. And I think that's something that we're going to probably come back to again and again on Comics Rot Your Brain, especially as we discuss comics from the 80s, because you and I read a lot of comics in the 80s, Chris, and I think we didn't realize at the time what a halcyon time and what a golden age the 80s really were for comics. But I think it really speaks to when there are movements in the air artistically, how that ambition and that sort of hope and potential in the air becomes kind of like a wind that lifts up everybody. And it's sort of like this rising tide lifting all boats, but not just in the terms of like sales or anything, but just in terms of artistic possibility and artistic imagination, because this is coming in the wake of Watchmen, Dark Knight, Mouse, and all those things happening a few years earlier. And this is at a moment where the potential for comics not just being for kids anymore feels, I think, truly limitless to the creators who are in that orbit. And you can see Milligan, Ewins, and Dillion taking full advantage of this. And this is their big break on an American comic for DC Comics. It's their first work for the publisher. And good Lord, are they swinging for the fences? And this is just an extraordinarily ambitious piece of work. And I think you just don't find that many comics that even try to do half as much as Milligan is doing storytelling wise with Screamer here. And I think it's something that should be remarked upon and noted, that for all the failings of the story, there are also considerable, tremendous successes. And I think that's exactly what I wanted us to be able to do on the show here is, like I say, kind of reckon with this work that exists, that's out there, that maybe not a lot of people are talking about, and just kind of hold it up in 2021 and just say what is brilliant here, what's good, bad, and indifferent, and in between. And I think there's a lot in Screamer that's amazing, and right down to the design and these incredible covers. And I think if you're curious at all about this batshit story you've heard us talking about, I would heartily recommend that everyone go read this, because we've only scratched the surface in some ways in terms of the bizarreness and the storytelling and the thought that's gone into so many levels of this. So I think it's a work that everyone should look at and be familiar with, because it's not a minor work. I think it's a fairly significant miniseries from DC in the 80s. I think it's a work that should be remembered and talked about, because there's a lot going on here that you don't see very often in a comic book.
No, you know what? I agree with everything you're saying. I feel like, it's one of the things that, like, even today, where you can pretty much publish what you want if you have some stature, maybe through Image, right? Like, I mean, I
Yep.
don't even feel like most of the Image books that, like, like the I mean, look, there's a lot of interesting kind of like science fiction stuff coming out of Image. A lot of it is like adventure science fiction or action science fiction, and this kind of like post-apocalyptic kind of like, it's like a fugue type of storytelling that I think there's very few writers who are able to approach this level of storytelling and what he's trying to say in the comics. And it's not, this is like something that I don't think again, it wouldn't translate well into a TV show or a movie, and it wouldn't work, and this wouldn't work as a novel. I think it's one of these few things that work solely perfectly as a comic, and that's above. Again, I'm not going to take away from anything that we were saying is problematic. I do feel that all the good things far outweigh the problematic stuff with it. It's not even really problematic. I mean, it's problematic. It's just, I think, from our lens. But then again, some of the violence is problematic, maybe from any era's lens. Um,
Yeah.
but look, I mean, Peter Milligan, like, I like remember his name more from like Shade, the Changing Man,
Right.
like more so than this. And I feel like, this is him kind of like, and Shade is like that's a superhero that he kind of like put into the Vertigo mold and kind of like altered up. And I kind of feel like
Yep.
again these characters who are able, these creators who are able to like do stuff whole cloth on their own without any kind of like IP driven stuff. I think they're always able to kind of like tread different ground that is more in tune with what really turns them on as creators and artists than I'm just trying to service like some corporate IP. Now, granted, corporate IP, like again, Shade, Swamp Thing, Sandman Mystery Theater, to name a few, like Animal Man, like aren't these kind of like, corporate shill work, but this is a different kind of thing. I mean, it's, I mean, I don't think that the Invisibles is able to be published unless this book is out. I don't know if most of stuff that comes out of Vertigo is able to come out unless this is out because 4 years before Vertigo, you read this and everyone is like, we can do this at DC. We can, I mean, like,
Yeah. Like if Pete Milligan could do that, like, oh shit, we can do literally just about anything.
I mean, it's testament to Karen Berger, like finding these British writers who could and artists who could bring something new to the comic world. Because that Marvel at this time in the late '80s was shutting down their epic line. I think the last truly long epic series that came out was Akira. And I think that was such a long running series because there was so much content. I think if that was a shorter book, they would have shut Epic down like a long time before that. I don't know if to do with the bankruptcy stuff that was going on or other kind of like weird kind of like publishing move things. I don't know how successful books like Dreadstar were. It wasn't that successful because he moved it to First after he took it away from after Epic got shut down. So I just think that the Epic wasn't the thing that Marvel was maybe trying to do, and I don't know, maybe just because Archie Goodwin had left. I'm not sure all the backstory on that, but I feel like
I'm not sure either.
this was laying the ground for what '90s comics could be. Because I feel like so many books that we love in the '90s, like does Stray Bullets does Stray Bullets exist without this book? Do so many books that were these independent things? Do they exist without something like Screamer? Like, I mean, particularly as you tell me it was up for like this award. Like, if this book came,
Yeah,
with,
it won the Eagle Award.
if this book came was under the radar and no one watched it or no one read it, that's a different story. But for it to win a major award is giving everyone license to go. We can like explode what's on our brain and tackle stories and tackle subjects and themes that we maybe couldn't do and we didn't think we could do in comics.
No, 100%. And 100%, and tackle them in a way that's so brutal and explicit. And yeah, the themes are the heaviest themes of like, existence, life, death, morality. I mean, this is the heaviest, weightiest stuff you can tackle in fiction. And Milligan goes there and he doesn't shirk from it. He doesn't hesitate. And I should say Milligan, Ewins, and Dillion and Zuko, they all go there. And actually, we haven't mentioned the letterer, Tom Frame, but it's hand lettering and the lettering looks terrific. And, love me some hand lettering and it looks great. Like the whole team did it just an immaculate job. It's an incredible piece of work. And yeah, and to everything you're saying, I think they blew the doors wide open. And I think it really did pave the way for a lot of stuff. And I will say my final comment will be that I know I've heard Grant Morrison talk about Pete Milligan, and just to your point about the Invisibles, I'm pretty sure that Grant and Pete were friends, and they knew each other well. But I've heard Grant talk about how Pete Milligan was and probably still is one of his favorite writers. And Grant Morrison really, really loved Pete Milligan's writing and thought very highly of him. And I remember hearing Grant Morrison say that he thought Enigma, the miniseries that Milligan would go on to do later for Vertigo, Grant Morrison holds that up as one of the greatest miniseries, one of the greatest comic book stories ever. I've heard him talk quite lovingly about Pete Milligan's Enigma. And, that really shows you that Milligan, I think, in a lot of ways is a lot of I don't know, he's a lot of writers' favorite writer, but he, even if his stories and his work never got the mainstream sort of acceptance of like a Watchmen or a Dark Knight, I think Milligan, sort of like Jamie Delano, was one of these British writers that people in the know realized was the real deal and is the real deal and is a writer of considerable talent and was putting out, and perhaps is still putting out. I haven't read his work recently, so I can't speak to it, but I think the feeling was clear amongst those who really understood comics and his fellow writers that Pete Milligan was a major talent. And I think Screamer really, really illustrates that beautifully, along with being a tremendous testament to the work of Brett Ewins and Steve Dillion. And I know that Milligan and Ewins did one other sci-fi gangster-ish looking book that I think I have a paperback of it, but I don't think I've ever read it. And it was called Johnny Nemo. And it was a book that was published in the UK. And so, yeah, who knows? Maybe we'll check that out and do a read through of that one day. But I just wanted to mention for the record that we are aware that there is another Milligan-Ewins collaboration out there. So perhaps we'll dive into that at some point. But they're a hell of a team, and Screamer's a hell of a book, and obviously has inspired a whole lot of discussion. So
sure.
I encourage everyone to check it out.
Okay, so that's this week's episodes of Comics Rot Your Brain. We will be back next week with some other books you probably haven't heard of or don't remember, or or maybe you have. We will see. But anyway, I'm Chris, and I am signing off for Steve as well. All right, guys.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.